In the late 1980s, the Eastern Bloc was sold off to the highest bidder thanks in large part to the CIA and US government. One by one, the legitimate left-wing governments of the Warsaw Pact were brought down. However, there was a pattern. The events themselves may have their nuances and surface differences, but overall one can see the fingerprint of American intelligence agencies and American capital interests pushing buttons behind the scenes. It's difficult to convey the scope and magnitude of the CIA's role in the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, but one thing is clear. Communism didn't fall in Eastern Europe. It was overthrown by the best coups money can buy. Known as the Christmas Revolution, the overthrow of the Romanian government was the only one to involve wide-scale violence. The upheaval started in Timișoara and soon spread to the rest of the country, culminating in the show trial of Romania's leader, Nicolae Ceausescu. Having been found guilty of his charges, he and his wife Elena were executed. Over 1,000 people died and several thousand were injured in addition to the executions. There's no dispute about the violence of this revolution. However, the source of the violence, how it was armed and funded, is left vague or left implied that the people, again timed with amorphous movements in other countries before the internet, somehow spontaneously rose up with weapons and a plan they just happened to have lying around. Romania's road to a communist government is unique amongst countries discussed in this series because Romania was a proud Axis ally, having had a fascist government very much in the image of Germany and Italy. As the Red Army closed in on Romania, the country decided it'd be better to be allies with the Soviet Union than fight them. Following the war, geopolitical maneuvering led to the Romanian Communist Party seizing power, which they did in 1947 by forcing King Michael to abdicate, thus creating the Socialist Republic of Romania. The Red Army occupied Romania and remained until 1958, ostensibly to aid the new government, especially since it had been a fascist nation just years before. Overstaying their welcome, sure, but for those upset by this, the US occupied Iceland during World War II and afterwards, promised to leave in 1946 and remained until 2006, yet this is never mentioned. In 1965, Ceausescu became General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party and began to implement policies counter to the Moscow line. He made the mistake of being super unbased, unnecessarily cringe, and repressive. That's a joke, but Romania is frequently ridiculed as an example of what not to do even in the most far left of spaces. A decade prior to the revolution, Romania was granted favored nation status by the United States, which is essentially a trade agreement. Then, in an oddly similar way and at a similar time frame, 1985 to 1986, the government began severe austerity measures in order to meet the demands of foreign creditors, such as the US-run International Monetary Fund. This caused food shortages and ubiquitous power outages, which of course upset the population. The reason for this was a mixture of bad economic policy, a maintenance of government subsidies for quality of life, and intentional sabotage of the socialist project of Romania. Now let's examine the CIA's role in all of this. The CIA's interest in socialist Romania began at the inception of the nation in 1947, with the US government funding counter-revolutionary elements throughout the Eastern Bloc immediately following World War II. Declassified CIA documents show that the agency had analyses of Romania's military capabilities and military production facilities. They also included scenarios for an overthrow of Ceausescu and the government at large, with a list of possible successors. These documents also state that Ceausescu was considered a maverick, a characterization parroted by US media. CIA documents show that the action plan for overthrowing Ceausescu and communism in Romania would be divided into 3 stages. I'll give the stages and what actually happened in Romania as part of that plan. First, maliciously slander the Romanian national government and destroy their image. This took the form of reporting gossip of various countries to the media as fact, exposing the so-called corruption and evil of the Ceausescu regime and portraying the regime's supposed ugly face. Second, generate hype around a single charismatic leader to replace the so-called dictator. The candidate they chose for this in Romania was Ion Iliescu. Third, desperately misrepresent or invent a tragedy to drive the people into action, the so-called suppression of the bloody tragedy. This took shape when a lie was circulated through Romanian media by the opposition that a deadly incident took place in Chișinău that supposedly ended with 93 people killed. Romanians watched their TVs in horrors as they saw blood, flesh, and corpses strewn and tossed about. The corpses they saw were collected from a morgue by the CIA bribing Romanian officials. It was all a hoax. Before we delve into the actual coup, we need to talk about an organization that will be central to the plot since their formation, or rather the timing of their formation, deserves its own sidebar. The Council of National Salvation, what a humble name, was a group of traitors top military brass which was formed 6 months before the supposed spontaneous uprising. This runs contrary to the official story that the group formed right then and there during demonstrations by workers. However, retired army generals and CNS member Nicolae Militaru was caught on video admitting that the Council of National Salvation was started by top military brass and that they began planning the coup 6 months before it occurred. Since it doesn't get clearer cut than that, let's move on to the events of 1989. Back to the video in just a minute. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Incogni. Every year, dozens of data breaches worldwide result in sensitive data being exposed on the net. According to the 2022 annual data breach report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, the number of victims has gone up nearly 41% from 2021. Hundreds of commercial databases exist, selling your information without you even knowing. People search sites can be accessed to find your name, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and much more. Anyone can access your personal information using people search sites. It doesn't include just marketing companies, but also potential employers, landlords, or bad actors. The information can be used to take loans out on your name, by insurance companies to possibly raise your fees, by spammers to subject you to spam calls, or worse. So how does Incogni solve this issue? Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. Through an automated process, Incogni will make sure that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. Whenever a new record pops up on a data broker site, Incogni will automatically take care of it. That's what makes Incogni's yearly subscription especially great. Incogni will continue protecting your data privacy for as long as you use the service. For my viewers, use the link below to get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. How do you get started? First, create an account. Grant Incogni the right to work for you by contacting data brokers on your behalf, and relax as Incogni requests your personal data removal, handles any objections from data brokers, and keeps you updated on their progress every step of the way. So what are you waiting for? Click my link in the description, get your 60% off an annual Incogni plan, and start protecting your data today. Thanks to Incogni for the sponsorship. This allows me to pay my editor fairly, which is much appreciated. Alright, back to the video. As the official story states, there was an unapproved demonstration by students in the city of Timișoara to commemorate the anniversary of a World War II tragedy. It was attacked by police, which is true. Then, of course, the story circulated that there was a large number of casualties. In a 20th December New York Times article, the White House latched onto this fake story and said in a statement that condemned Romania's crackdown on demonstrators as brutal. No evidence was provided to support these claims, of course. While the military was obviously involved since the 17th of December, they suddenly withdrew from Timișoara on the 20th, which allowed the mob to storm and ransack the local party headquarters. Unbeknownst to both the protesters and the Ceausescu government, this was an omen of the betrayal to come. To counter these demonstrations, Ceausescu held a rally in Bucharest on the 21st of December in a misguided attempt to show he still had the support of the people, but was met with protest chants and mixed reception. He fled with his wife the next day after anti-government protesters forced their way into the building in which they were seeking safety. In the days that followed, civilians killed each other in a state of terrorism psychosis, stoked by false claims by the opposition led by Ion Iliescu. As is common for Western color revolution attempts, rooftop snipers emerged, shot indiscriminately, usually at the pro-government side, and then disappeared without a trace. While no clear answer has emerged as to when or how the shooting started or by whom, it is known that the CIA hired armed personnel, a mix of a group called the Romanian Civilian Armed Forces, and many unnamed Western agents. Shortly after the chaos subsided, Ion Iliescu seized power and formed a government with himself at its head. The US government intervened starting in January 1990 by instructing the envoy in Romania to take preliminary actions to encourage the process of privatization. And the embassy cables gloated about how they were now able to exploit Romanians in numerous thus far unthinkable ways. Romania is a tricky case because of thus far still classified information. Did the USSR know, for example? Did they participate? How deep was CIA involvement? These are questions that only the future will answer. The new liberal government used the US legal system as the model, and US legal experts were present to advise on the new Romanian constitution. Romanian politicians would be quote-unquote convinced that the benefits the US could offer were dependent on the government towing the American line on selective elections and the rights of the owning class, particularly foreign private interests in Romanian public property. Throughout the 90s, the US Agency for International Development, USAID, would do the dirty work of manipulating public opinion by starting a propaganda campaign titled Good Morning Romania, which was started, and I quote USAID themselves, to protect economic reform in Romania from a public opinion backlash and to maintain the commitment of the population to privatization and economic reform. A commitment that never existed, by the way. This took the form of radio broadcasts, television and film, brochures, seminars, amongst much, much more. Once the foundations of the new liberal state were established, they began their work dismantling the state for profit, as is typical. They abolished a law banning foreign trade, which allowed for negotiations with the IMF to begin in 1993, with an important caveat. Romania had to enter its currency onto the tumultuous and unpredictable global market, thereby weakening the currency and damaging purchasing power at home. The three major cash infusions promised by the IMF wouldn't materialize in the end, however, because Romania wasn't selling off state assets fast enough, go figure. A new law approved full private ownership of investments and business. As a result, many state-owned businesses were sold to foreign capitalists all throughout the 90s. Papers written about privatization frankly gloat about the fact, stating, in 1997-98, 2,200 companies were privatized, and in 1999, 1,772 were privatized, to American, Dutch, Portuguese, and French investment firms. 1 year later, the new government successfully sold Olchim, the country's largest chemical plant, to a Canadian firm, and Banca Agricola, one of its biggest banks, to a consortium including an Austrian bank, as well as 96 other firms. Privatization of Romania's largest company, steelmaker Sidex, is underway at the present time. Guarantees for full employment disappeared overnight, and the paper The Mass Privatization Process in Romania, a case of failed Anglo-Saxon capitalism states, mass privatization allowed for a much quicker transition to a market economy. Once an enterprise is in the private sector, management is provided with strong incentives to conduct business in a more efficient and profitable manner. This is because government subsidies will no longer be there for the inefficient to fall back on, and the threat of unemployment and bankruptcy became very real, essentially threatening people with homelessness and starvation should they not work for ever-expanding profit. Despite this talk of efficiency, a downturn of between 25 and 40% was seen in industrial production, construction, transportation, and trade from 1989 to 1992. Despite these efforts, the recession that has plagued Romania's economy since 1990 had not come to an end by the beginning of 1995, states a study on the privatization effort. Land was decollectivized and privatized, resulting in a huge decline in agricultural output, which turned Romania from an exporter to a net importer of grain in 1992. Another report states, in 2008, the petrochemical industry had a production capacity of only 35% compared to 1989, 90% of chemical companies ceasing to operate. Agriculture also suffered, with only 5 million hectares being exploited from the 9.3 of the total available in 2009. In fact, the transition was so productive for Romania that it resulted in over a decade of lost economic development, which only began reversing in 2005. State assets and companies were divided up and sold off as vouchers in a cute attempt of getting regular Romanians to own stake in the newly private companies, much like what was attempted in Russia and Czechoslovakia. Privatization was never popular, but the shock doctrine maniacs never cared. A report sympathetic to privatization states, reformers need public support for privatization as well as for other reforms. It quickly became clear, however, that the public's expectations could never be fully met. Share distribution through vouchers was at best a small property inheritance following the years of communist propaganda, according to which the state's property belonged to the people. What they're saying is, at best, it could only be sold as the people's ownership, relying on socialist conceptions. At worst, it was the selling off of the people's wealth. That bit is left unsaid. Hold on, wouldn't the deep poverty Romania had just entered into, coupled with the rapidly inflating prices of all areas of life, result in people with vouchers they can't do anything with aside from sell for cash so that they can eat another day? Well, that's exactly what happened. This practice led to a significant concentration of vouchers in the hands of a small number of wealthy Romanian investors who later could have acquired large stakes in commercial companies. Subsequent studies found that an average of only 18.7% of the shares of the companies were actually transferred to Romanian citizens. To no one's surprise, corruption skyrocketed, with the newly so-called democratic and Western-oriented reformers in parliament magically also owning massive stake in former public assets. In Romania, state capture activities between industrial managers and politicians followed a paradigmatic situation in which hierarchy politicians were also members on the management boards of state-owned enterprises engaged in privatization. A first report by the government's control department in 2000 found that 75 parliamentarians were members of 51 boards of directors, management boards, or audit commissions. Following this debacle, scammers saw big bucks in exploiting a population naive to capitalism, and in the early 90s, the Caritas Ponzi scheme was set up, promising 8 times returns in only 6 months. The heavily impoverished Romanian population, living with inflation rates as high as 300%, grabbed at the investment quote-unquote opportunity. Between April 1992 and August 1994, Caritas attracted millions of regular Romanians from all over the country that invested more than 1 trillion lei, between $1 and $5 billion, before it finally went bankrupt in August of 1994, having a debt of $450 million. Research into this continuously blamed poor Romanians for the success of this Ponzi scheme. How lovely. Housing was also privatized, with state-owned apartments sold off at below-market prices and at negative interest rates to whoever would buy, which included Western private investors hoping to create renting empires of their own. Dying communities and the centralization of all decent employment in so-called business districts of major cities resulted in, and I quote, average housing costs in Romania accounting for a much higher share of household income than is the case in other European transitional countries, exceeding 40% of household income. Price controls on food were removed, causing a threefold increase in prices. The previously mostly unknown phenomenon of unemployment now affected millions, and by 1994, 50% of the population was living on $160 per month. As if I need to drive the point home further, a 2010 poll showed that 63% of Romanians believe, correctly, that life for them was better under socialism, despite how sad and bad of an attempt it was at socialism. Privatization continues to this day, with targets as diverse as the National Petroleum Company, the Bucharest water and sewer system, and practically everything else. From these examples, it should be clear that the so-called Iron Curtain didn't so much fall as it was torn down, just as it was put up by the US and their foreign policy interests. Each and every time that socialism in a country fell to neoliberal ghouls, the quality of life for citizens plummeted off a cliff while prices soared and jobs became scarce. I've made a video on that here. State assets were sold off, usually for pennies on the dollar, to foreign capitalists, ensuring that not even native capitalists could benefit, or benefit as much. The biggest winner in all of these revolutions weren't the people, the bureaucrats, or even the leaders of the coups. It was the United States, its allies, and the owners of capital they all serve. Socialist Romania was a historical study of what not to do in general, but that doesn't make the subsequent coup and exploitation of Romania okay. Romania's population, particularly the youth, is declining due to immigration and lack of economic opportunity. This decline in population is so massive that it's causing environmental degradation due to neglect, particularly in rural Romania. Romania is now also known as a hub for sexually exploited minors and trafficked women. The Romanian people deserve better, and the brand of continental capitalism and native vassalage being sold to them isn't the solution. That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon, it really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Nitro Dubs, Kenny, Thomas Roberts, Nicholas, Owen Baker, T. Wood, Dr. Lemonman, Lumix, Charlie and Eric, Ultimate Turin, Daniel Ethel, The Generic Guy, Santiago Pereira, Rain, Cassandra Corvus, David Fries, Confuse M, Mariana Mastusovic, Robbie Richardson, and Masay Kadro. Thanks for watching.